Thank you for joining Shelby and me as we continue reading October's Sky. Today, we're starting chapter 5. It's titled Quentin. Let's get started. Quentin was the class joke. He used a lot of big words, often delivered in a pseudo-English accent, and he carried around an old, cracked leather briefcase stuffed to overflowing with books and who knew what else. While the rest of us played dodgeball or did calisthenics and phys ed, he always had some excuse not to participate, a sprained ankle or a headache or some such, and sat in the bleachers and read one of his books. While all the other students traded gossip and nonsense in the auditorium in the morning and at lunch, Quentin always sat alone. He had no friends as far as I could tell. Although everybody, including me, made fun of him, I was pretty certain he was some sort of genius. He could expound on nearly any subject in class until the teacher had to ask him to stop, and if he'd ever made less than 100 on a test, I wasn't aware of it. I figured if there was anybody who might know how to build a rocket, it was Quentin. The next morning, before classes, I sat down beside him in the auditorium. Startled, he pulled his book down from his face. "I don't let anybody copy my homework," he said suspiciously. "I don't want to copy your homework," I replied, although I would have taken his algebra if he had offered. "Do you know anything about rockets?" A little smile crossed his face. Quentin wasn't a bad-looking kid for a genius. He had a narrow face, a sharp nose, crisp blue eyes, and jet black hair that looked as if it had been plastered down with about a quart of wild root cream oil. "I wondered how long it would take for you to come to me with that question. I heard about your rocket, old boy. Blew up, did it? What made you think you could build a rocket? Can't even do algebra." "I'm getting better," I muttered. It was amazing to me that everybody, even Quentin, knew my business. "One of my little sisters can already do algebra," he advised me. "I taught her. It's really quite simple." In less than a minute, he'd already pretty much irritated me. "So what do you know about rockets?" I asked him. "Anything?" "I know everything," he replied. He had said it too easily. "Let's hear it then," I said, doubtfully. He raised one of his bony shoulders in a shrug. "What's in it for me? What do you want?" "To help you build the next one." That was a surprise. "If you know so much, why don't you build your own?" I demanded. Quentin built a little church with his hands. "I've considered building a rocket for some time, if you must know. Practical reasons, unfortunately, have prevented me from taking action. It takes teamwork to build a rocket, and materials. My observation of you is that you have certain leadership abilities that I do not." He locked his eyes on me. They were intense, almost like they were capable of shooting rays. "The other boys will follow you," he said, "and you, being the Colwood superintendent's son, can probably get all the materials you need." His ray gun eyes made me want to look away, but I didn't. "What's your angle?" I demanded. "Ha ha," he exclaimed. "The same as you, old chap. If I learn how to build a rocket, I'll stand a better chance of getting on down at the Cape." "First, you gotta go to college," I reminded him. "I'll go to college," he said resolutely. "But it won't hurt to get some good practical rocket building experience under my belt." He put out his hand. "How about it? You want to team up?" It was the best offer I'd gotten since I'd started my rocket building career, but I was still a little reluctant. I didn't have much of a reputation at Big Creek, but it was still better than Quentin's. When I didn't respond to his hand, he grabbed mine and shook it, big strokes up and down. I hastily pulled my hand away and looked around to see if anybody had noticed. I knew the football boys would accuse me of holding hands with Quentin if any of them had seen it. "So what do you know?" I demanded. My face flushed with the potential embarrassment of it all. "Calm down, old chap," he said. "All shall become perfectly clear. He leaned back and took a deep breath and then began to talk just as if he was reading something straight from a book. The Chinese are reputed to have invented rocketry. Something called Chinese arrows are mentioned in Europe and the Middle East as far back as the 13th century. The British used rockets later aboard their warships during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. That's where the rocket's red glare comes from in the Star-Spangled Banner. Then there was the Russian Tsiolkovsky, Goddard the American, and von Braun, of course. Each of them added to the body of rocket knowledge. Tsiolkovsky was a theorist. Goddard applied engineering principles, and I stopped him. I don't need to know this stuff. I need to know how a rocket works. Quentin cocked his head. But that's so elementary. Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I remembered from one science class or another something about Newton, but I couldn't put my finger on his laws. How do you know that? Read it somewhere. Read it where? Quentin frowned, disturbed at my attempt to cut through his bull. A physics book, I suppose, he said stiffly. Can't exactly say which one. I thumb over to Welch every Saturday to the county library. I tend to pick out random shelves and just read every book on it until I'm done. I could see it was going to be necessary to be more specific with Quentin. What kind of fuel does a rocket use? The Chinese use black powder. Black powder? He looked at me carefully as if to determine if I was joking. Black powder. It contains potassium nitrate, saltpeter, and charcoal and sulfur. Saltpeter, Quentin sighed and then explained in some detail the chemical's properties. It was an oxidizer, which, when combined with other chemicals, produce heat and gas necessary to make a rocket fly. It can also kill you down there, he finished up, pointing at his crotch. What do you mean? It fixes men so they can't, What? Quentin flushed. He straightened a crooked finger. That? Really? Well, that's what I read. I thought I'd better get back to rockets. Where can I buy some of this black powder? You can't buy it, far as I know, he said. You got to mix it up. Saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. That's what we need. Can you get it? I wasn't certain, but I wasn't going to let him know it. I'll get right on it. Quentin grinned broadly and suddenly started to rattle on like I was his best friend. He opened up his briefcase and showed me all the books within, most of them on general science, but one of them a novel titled Tropic of Cancer. You want to know about girls? This is the one, he said slyly. I already know about girls. He tapped the book. No, you don't. When the bell rang and we stood up, I noticed for the first time Quentin's worn, faded shirt, thin at the elbows, and his patched cotton pants, and his scuffed ankle-high shoes. Quentin wasn't a Coalwood boy. He came from Bartley. He was one of the kids my mother told me to notice. The mine at Bartley was always having cutoffs and strikes, and in the last few years, many Bartley families had slid into poverty and misery. Quentin's father was probably out of a job. In 1957, southern West Virginia, you wouldn't likely starve if you didn't have any money. There was always bread and commodity cheese you could get from the government, but that was about all there was. Roy Lee stopped me in the hall. What were you talking to that moron Quentin about? And did I see you holding his hand? I was peeved enough at Roy Lee to not answer, but then I figured it would aggravate him more to tell him the truth. We're going to build a rocket, him and me. A surge of kids passed us, Dorothy Plunk among them. Hi, Sonny, Roy Lee, she called angelically. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Roy Lee shook his head and leaned against the lockers. God almighty, you want to stop all chance of ever having any kind of social life? Dorothy Plunk sees you and Quentin hanging out together, she's going to lose interest right there. I looked after her, trying not to stare at her cute little bottom swinging back and forth down the hall. Dorothy doesn't care anything about me anyway, I said, sort of breathless. Roy Lee didn't try to hide what he was looking at. He watched Dorothy all the way down the hall. Whew, he whistled. He pulled his eyes back to me. You got good taste anyway, Sonny. Why don't you ask her out? Double date with me next weekend. We'll go parking at the Coretta Fan. She'd just say no. Roy Lee shook his head again as if I was the burden of his life. If you don't ask her out, I will. You wouldn't do that, I bleated. He wiggled his eyebrows at me, his crooked grin clearly salacious. Oh, but I would. Roy Lee had me in a box. If he asked Dorothy out and she went, I wasn't sure I could live through it, knowing what Roy Lee was likely to try with her. And what if she did it? Or if Roy Lee claimed she did? My life would be pretty much ruined forever. I had no choice. I chased after Dorothy, catching her with Emily Sue at the entrance to biology class. I'm sorry, I got sick over the worm, Dorothy said, first thing. Dorothy, I said, my heart pounding in my ears, would you like to go to the dance with me Saturday night with Roy Lee? In his car, Her big blues blinked. But I already have plans. The blood drained from my face. Oh, but if you'd come over to my house on Sunday afternoon, she purred, I'd love to study biology with you. To her house? I'll be there, I swore. What should I bring? Just yourself, silly. She looked me over, studying me, and I kind of thought she liked what she was seeing. We'll have so much fun, she concluded. Emily Sue had been observing all this. Be a little careful with this one, Dorothy, she said. Whatever do you mean? Dorothy asked her friend. They talked to each other as if I weren't even there. Sonny's nice, Emily Sue said succinctly. Well, so am I, Dorothy said back. She went on into the classroom. Roy Lee had been loitering nearby, listening. He came up and stood beside Emily Sue. What do you think? He said. They were talking as if I weren't there too. Dangerous, Emily Sue told him, but probably not fatal. During class, I couldn't help but sneak looks at Dorothy at her desk while she worked on a drawing of frog intestines. She had the adorable habit of letting the pink tip of her tongue protrude from her full, delectable lips while she concentrated. She was wearing a white pinafore blouse with a blue ribbon around its collar, which made her look so innocent, yet the way she filled the blouse troubled me with indecent thoughts. She caught me looking once and gave me a demure little smile while I blushed. I couldn't figure out how so much perfection could wind up in one person. Then a little misery inserted itself. If Dorothy had plans for Saturday night, I didn't imagine it was to bake cookies with her mother.